Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to episode 3 of the Sea Battles series. This one is titled Lord Horatio Nelson. In order to maintain her position as a world power, England needed supremacy at sea. She was a small island, dependent on colonies all over the world, and she had to protect her sea lanes. It was swashbuckling Horatio Nelson who reigned mastery of the seas of England in the 18th century. Nelson was born on September 29th, 1758, at Norfolk. He was a sickly child, but he wanted to become a seaman more than anything else in the world. In 1770, he heard that his uncle, Maurice Suckling, had been appointed to the command of the Reasonable, and he begged to join him. On the ship he sailed to the Falkland Islands. He was just 12 years old. A little later, he made a year's voyage on a West Indian merchant, on which he learned the essentials of his profession. In 1773, an expedition was fitted out by the Royal Geographical Society to sail to the North Pole. Young Nelson, then only 14, was wild to go. No boys were allowed by the Admiralty, but he finally prevailed upon Captain Lutwig of the Caracas to let him be coxswain. When he returned from the icebound seas the year following, he was a full-fledged able seaman. Then came a 3-year voyage to the East Indies under Admiral Hughes. This cruise along fever-stricken, marshy shores undermined his health. He underwent a long and dangerous sickness. For at least one moment in his life, he felt an overpowering despondency. He saw before him the towering obstacles he must face in his chosen profession, and the lack of physical strength he had to meet them. His ambition consumed him, but his mind could see no way to satisfy it. This was how he afterward referred to it. After a long and gloomy reverie, in which I almost wished upon myself overboard, a sudden flow of patriotism was kindled within me, and I saw my king and countrymen, very much smaller and weaker than I, needing my aid. My mind exulted in the idea. Well then, I exclaimed, I will be a hero, and confiding in Providence, I will brave every danger. In those early years and throughout his entire lifetime, duty and fame spurred him on. Duty kindled in him the most fearless and unswerving devotion to his fellow men. Renown lured him ever onward with its glittering honors. Nelson's promotion was swift. In July 1778, he had won a first lieutenancy on the Bristol, the flagship of Sir Peter Parker. 6 months later, he was appointed commander of the Badger, a brig. Then he was made post-captain of the frigate Hitchingbrook, with which he sailed against American privateers in the West Indies. On February 1st, 1793, France declared war against Great Britain and Holland. 2 days before, his government had appointed Nelson the Agamemnon, a 64-gun ship. During the next 4 years, Nelson took part in many minor engagements, all helpful to his cause. Among these were the sieges of Marseille and Toulon, and the blockading of Bastia. In the later action, while serving the battery, a shot of the enemy sent sand into his right eye, and he eventually lost the sight of that eye. His first important naval operation was the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, fought against the Spaniards, the allies of France, in 1797. At dawn on February 14th, the British fleet of 15 ships under Sir John Jarvis lay 25 miles west of Cape St. Vincent on the southern coast of Portugal. They soon spotted the Spanish fleet, 27 huge ships. Among these were the great Santissima Trinidad, carrying 126 guns, and the San Josef of 112 guns. One was a 4-decker, the largest type of ship afloat, and 7 were 3-deckers. The Spanish ships were in 2 sections, an awkward position. The British admiral made the signal to prepare, At 11 o'clock, the line was formed, and at 11:30, action began. Nelson's ship was 13th in line. The plan of Sir John was to run between the two divisions of the enemy's fleet, preventing their junction, and then attack them separately. When he had succeeded in dividing them, he made the signal to tack in succession. Seeing that the Spanish admiral planned to run behind the British column and unite his lines, Nelson, without orders, passed from the rear between the Diadem and Excellent, reaching the Spanish column ahead of his compatriots. He attacked the huge and formidable Santissima Trinidad. The Culloden, leader of the British van, came to his support, and for an hour the two plucky British ships battled it out with the 9 other Spanish vessels, which had come to the aid of their great consort. Then the pair of British boats were joined by the Blenheim and the Excellent. The enemy craft San Isidro and Salvador del Mundo were compelled to strike their colors. Nelson's own ship, the Captain, was badly damaged. There was not a sail, shroud, or halyard left intact. Her wheel had been shot away. She was not able to chase or to run away. So she worked up alongside the San Nicolas, and Nelson ordered a party to board her. Captain Barry was the first to leap to the Spaniard's deck. He was followed by Nelson himself. A few volleys of musket and pistol shot were exchanged, then the enemy backed away. Barry gained possession of the poop and hauled down the Spanish colors. Nelson on the forecastle received the swords of the Spanish officers. Then the San Josef came to the aid of her distressed sister ship and fired on the British aboard the San Nicolas. Nelson promptly called for reinforcements from the captain. Without waiting, he ran across to the farther side of the enemy's deck and sprang to the rail of a large 3-deck Spanish ship, which lay close on that quarter. As he reached the deck, the second enemy craft, he met a Spanish officer. Apparently believing that the British had boarded him also, and that resistance was hopeless, he gave his sword to the dumbfounded Nelson and said, "We surrender." Nelson was made a rear admiral and ordered to Santa Cruz to capture a Spanish merchant ship, which was on its way from Manila to Cadiz. The British Admiralty wanted to intercept the rich cargo intended for the Spanish treasury. Nelson had a fleet of 4 warships, a cutter and 3 frigates, carrying a landing party of 1,000 men under Captain Trowbridge. They tried to land at Santa Cruz at night, but the wind and current prevented them. They were forced to wait 4 days before the current permitted them to land. As each day passed, the chances of victory diminished. The Spanish fleet had seen them and were preparing their defense. Nelson did attack at night, 4 days late. As soon as his landing party was in range, the Spanish opened fire. A great number of the English were hit, but Nelson led the survivors to the shore and drove back the 500 Spaniards defending it. Then the town opened fire. Nelson, wounded in the elbow, was forced to retreat. The cutter, Fox, was sunk, and Nelson personally supervised the rescue of the crew. Then he climbed on board his flagship, the Theseus, and calmly called the surgeon to amputate his arm. The expedition was a failure. It was costly to Nelson, who not only lost his arm, but nearly died from an infection following the crude surgery. The Fight of the Nile. In France, Napoleon Bonaparte was rising to the head of the army of the new French Republic. By 1798, he had conquered the adjoining countries and had made peace with the continental European powers. Only England stood in Napoleon's way. He chose to attack her in the Mediterranean and to capture Egypt at the same time. He assembled a tremendous fleet and equipped an army so secretly that the British were unaware of what he was doing. But the British government was expecting a French attack of some sort, and on the theory that the best defense is an offense, it sent Nelson to the Mediterranean to keep an eye on Napoleon's maneuvers. Nelson, in command of the Vanguard, a 74-gun ship, was off Cadiz with Lord St. Vincent. St. Vincent gave him 2 ships of the line, the Orion and the Alexander, and 4 frigates, and sent him to watch Toulon and follow the movements of the French fleet. From off Cape Sissi, Nelson reported that 19 ships were in the harbor of Toulon, that transports with troops frequently arrived from Marseille, that 12,000 men were already aboard the warships, and that the fleet was expected to sail for an unknown port in a few days. The French fleet succeeded in slipping out of the harbor without Nelson detecting it until too late. A strong gale had dismantled the Vanguard, and she had been towed to a port on the coast of Sardinia for repairs. The same storm drove the other vessels far apart, and precious days were lost in reassembling them. It was not until June 7th that Nelson, bolstered by the addition of 10 other ships from St. Vincent, took up his famous pursuit of Bonaparte. He had been ordered to attack him wherever found. The French had a good start, and all Nelson knew was that they had sailed southward between Italy and Corsica, and had been seen by a passing vessel off the north end of Sicily, heading east. The British squadrons started a long and tedious search. There were times when they expected to come within sight of the enemy at any moment, other times when they despaired of ever seeing him. Nelson's heavy warship moved too slow to catch the French fleet. On June 15th, he learned from a Tunisian cruiser that the French had been seen off Trapani in Sicily. On the 26th, news came from Cape Passaro that the enemy had arrived and had taken Malta, and then gone eastward. From this, Nelson was now pretty well convinced that Bonaparte intended to take some port in Egypt, establish himself at the head of the Red Sea, and carry a large army into Hindustan. Such a move would jeopardize British interests in India. But Egypt was a large country, and Nelson didn't know which port the French would attack. He consulted his captains and decided to head for Alexandria. No French ship was spotted on the way to the Egyptian port. There was no sign of a French flag when Nelson reached Alexandria. Nelson was frantic with disappointment. He headed back for the north shore of the Mediterranean and returned to Syracuse. Actually, Napoleon was headed for Alexandria, but Nelson had reached the port first. The French fleet had passed within gun range on its way to Candia, a neighboring port, and neither fleet had spotted the other. Nelson stopped long enough to replenish supplies and started out again. He combed the Egyptian coast, but he didn't spot the French until he decided to return to Alexandria. He was puzzled but not unprepared when he saw the French in Aboukir Bay, 15 miles from Alexandria. His plan of attack had been set for nearly a month. The two fleets faced each other across a network of dangerous shoals and reefs. The British officer didn't know the waters and surrounding islands, so they were forced to move slowly. They circled Aboukir Point and advanced in single file. The Goliath led the attack, followed by the Zealous, the Orion, the Audacious, and the Theseus. Nelson's flagship, the Vanguard, was sixth in line. The Goliath and the Zealous opened up with their heaviest guns, and 10 minutes later, Nelson gave the signal to engage the enemy at short range. The British ships swung into their positions. The French sent a concentrated broadside into their bows. Then the Goliath and the Zealous worked around the enemy's flank. Although deluged by raking fire, they passed inside his line. A moment later, the inshore side was taken by the Orion, the Theseus, and the Audacious, while the Vanguard and 4 other vessels engaged the French front and center on the outside. The Theseus and the Gruyere engaged in almost a grapple not 6 feet apart. The guns of the former, loaded with 2 and 3 round shot, belched their flame and hot lead directly into her adversary. The mizzenmasts of the French ship fell by the board, her foremast having gone before. A little way off, the Conquérant and the Spartier, both French, were also dismasted. Nelson was struck down. A bullet hit him in the forehead, blinding him completely for the moment. Quickly he was carried below in the arms of Captain Barry, and a surgeon summoned. After his wound had been dressed, and while he was still suffering intensely, he groped for a pen and paper and scrawled the first words of his dispatch to St. Vincent announcing the victory. The victory of Trafalgar. Nelson went on to a brilliant victory at Copenhagen. He was raised to the rank of Viscount, and in October 1801 took his seat in the House of Lords. At the same time, a truce with the French Republic was announced, and the following March a treaty of peace was signed. Just a little over a year later, in May 1803, war with France broke out again. Nelson was appointed commander-in-chief of the king's ships in the Mediterranean. On the 18th, he hoisted his flag on board the Victory, the ship whose name was to become as immortal as his own. Napoleon rebuilt his navy at Toulon and Brest. He drilled an army of 150,000 men. He was mapping plans for all-out invasion of England. He was not aware that no one was to invade the small island from the 16th century to the present. So he gave orders to have his fleet assembled at the West Indies to sail from Dover Straits. Lord Nelson and Sir Richard Bickerton undertook the blockade of Toulon. It was difficult to keep the French vessels within from getting out, and keeping those from without from getting in. But through fair weather and foul, calms, winds, squalls, and gales, the blockading was carried on, although only 4 of his ships were strictly seaworthy craft. Nelson knew the importance of preventing the junction of the French squadrons, and he made up his mind to maintain his vigil if it should take him the rest of his life. If the French ships did not attempt to break through at Toulon, he would fight. Or did attempt, he would fight. This is exactly what the French did. After being bottled up by the British for fully a year and a half, their fleet under Admiral Villanueva slipped quietly out of Toulon harbor on the night of January 17th, bound for Sardinia. Nelson's 2 lookout frigates spotted Villanueva 2 days later. Within 3 hours, Nelson started his chase. He scoured the Mediterranean in the worst weather he had ever seen. Gale after gale tossed his ships over the angry waters. Bad weather played havoc with the French ships also, and Villanueva was driven to return to the port he had just left for repairs. When the craft had all been refitted, Villanueva set sail. Meanwhile, Nelson, unaware that Villanueva was doing, had been battling and drifting with the storms. He had gone to Naples, Sicily, and Sardinia, to Alexandria, Candia, and Malta. He had covered the channel from Barbary to Toro with frigates and the fleet. Yet, of course, he saw nothing of the French fleet. He made up his mind finally to go out of the Mediterranean, working westward. Storms and unfavorable winds continued to dog him. Through the strait, through the Gut, past Cape St. Vincent, then straight across the Atlantic to the West Indies, the British fleet struggled on. Then came the Barbados and fresh rumors that the French fleet had been seen in the Caribbean waters. On he plowed to Tobago, to Trinidad, to Montserrat, to Antigua. Had the enemy been at Antigua? Yes, but he had gone. Once more he had slipped through Nelson's fingers. Following rumors as to the direction taken by the French, he now turned about and headed across the Atlantic toward Cadiz. On July 18th, 3 months after he had left the Strait of Gibraltar and had covered nearly 7,000 miles of sea, he sighted Cape Spartel. But there was no French fleet. 2 days later he reached Cadiz and went on shore for the first time in 2 years. A few days later he heard that the enemy had been seen steering northward. He went north, but found nothing. Receiving orders to return to England, he sailed for Spithead. His stay was short. 2 weeks after his arrival, he sailed from Portsmouth to Cadiz, where he joined Vice Admiral Collingwood. The force under his command then consisted of 27 warships, and there in the harbor were the combined fleets of France and Spain under the command of Villanueva and Gravina. They had 36 warships and a number of frigates apparently all ready for sea. Nelson resumed his blockade. He kept an eye on the French and Spanish fleets as he cruised near Cape Trafalgar. On October 19th, the warning flashed. The French were moving out of port. Nelson headed toward the Strait of Gibraltar to stop the French from entering the Mediterranean. After 2 years and 4 months of waiting, Nelson had caught the French fleet. They would have to fight now. 2 days later, the entire French and Spanish fleets were out of port and were formed in a curved line of battle stretching 5 miles from tip to tip off the southern coast of Spain. On one side lay Cadiz, on the other, Cape Trafalgar. In the far distance was the Strait of Gibraltar and the British. Nelson barked orders to his fleet and retired to his cabin to write the simple prayer. May the great God, whom I worship, grant to my country, and for the benefit of Europe in general, a great and glorious victory. Amen. Then he gave his last address. England accepts every man will do his duty. Directing her guns full upon the Spanish line, the royal sovereign began firing as soon as she was within range. At the same time, Nelson's ship, the Victory, swept down upon the Bucentaur on the French wing. As Nelson drew nearer, the whole artillery of the French van was directed upon him. He opened up on the Bucentaur with such a terrific fire that 20 of her guns were dismounted and 400 of her men killed or wounded. Leaving the French flagship to his consorts, Nelson now turned his attention to the Redoutable, which had already attacked him. Running up close to the second French ship, he ordered the guns on that side to be fired. As they spat out their flame and shot, the Redoutable shivered, for the range was so close that the guns of both vessels were almost touching. Nelson and Captain Hardy paced the quarterdeck of the Victory. Almost above them, 50 feet up, the mizzen top of the rival craft swarmed with the best of France's sharpshooters. They had been told by their commander to bring down Nelson, the officer with the medals, if they had the chance. He stood below them in clear view. French muskets were quickly raised to the enemy mizzen top. The muzzles were trained downward at the calm and unconcerned one-armed admiral. Suddenly the English spotted French sharpshooters. They cried to Nelson to take cover, and they fired into the French mizzen top. But it was too late. As Nelson wheeled about, the French sharpshooters' guns cracked, and Nelson, shot through the back, fell to the deck. Captain Hardy was over him quickly. "They have done for me at last," gasped the great admiral. "My backbone is shot through." He was carried below to the cockpit among the wounded and the dying, where everything was done to relieve his suffering. There for 3 hours he lay, listening intently to the battle going on above. He asked each newcomer to the cockpit, "Are we still winning?" Before he lapsed into unconsciousness, he knew that the Bucentaur had been taken, that while his flag was still flying, 17 of the French and Spanish ships had been captured, and one of the most glorious of British sea victories was being won. As he was closing his eyes for the last time, the roaring guns stopped and everything was quiet when he whispered his final words, "Thank God, I have done my duty." If you've reached it to the end of this video, I thank you for your time. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy what I'm doing here. Also, as a reminder, because these books were written in a different time and a different societal expectation, any inappropriate or offensive verbs or other parts of speech that may have been within the story do not reflect my personal or political beliefs and are only being read as they are written. Thank you so much for taking the time to sit with me today. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.